So I am now joined by who else? Paul Prescod, Labor Paul, to talk about the ongoing rail negotiations. Paul has a new article in Jacobin titled Rail Unions and Employers Have a Tentative Agreement, but a Strike Isn't Off the Table. Paul, great to see you as always.
Great to be back and talking about labor again.
Of course. So of course there have been some interesting developments with the rail negotiations and the prospect of a rail strike. Just to kind of catch people up, I want to mention that you were on the show previously a few weeks ago, kind of giving some of the background on the conditions that led up to this point. So maybe just do to start off a very quick summary of kind of what has happened so far up to the point of last week's tentative agreement. What was it that the rail workers were asking for?
Yeah, so first, these negotiations were started back in 2020. That's when the
Mhm.
contract originally expired. So they've been, at it since then, trying to get a deal. Now, and I know I covered this on the last segment, but rail negotiations are covered by the Railway Labor Act, which also covers a lot of airline workers. And it's basically a different kind of collective bargaining arrangement that was arranged by the government primarily to prevent a strike at all costs, realizing how strategic and how vital this sector was to the economy. So, under the Railway Labor Act, after a certain amount of time, if an agreement isn't reached, the president can appoint the Presidential Emergency Board, or the PEB. So Biden did that in the summer. And after the Presidential Emergency Board is supposed to present recommendations to the rail unions to vote on, and then the railways can vote on that. And then after that, there's another cooling off period before when they could strike. So to go to where, what are the issues animating workers? The biggest thing that seems to really be firing workers up is not necessarily pay. It's actually the attendance and scheduling issues. And this actually almost turned into a strike at one of the railways, BNSF, back in the winter, where they introduced a new scheduling policies. But basically, rail workers really do not have any sick days. They have very little paid time off. They spend a lot of time away from their families on their routes. It's very normal for them to be weeks, months on end away from their families, maybe come back for 2 days, and they're always on call. So this issue of scheduling has really been the animating factor. And the Presidential Emergency Board, when they put out their recommendations, it included recommendations mostly on wages, a little bit on benefits, but did not even touch the scheduling issue. So I think that's a big reason why negotiations had to keep going until last week, where they reaching a tentative agreement that does touch on that issue a little bit. But really, it's coming down to how unsustainable this job has gotten for rail workers. This is a job where it's a very good union job in some sense. You can make up to over 100,000 a year, very good benefits. For so long, this is the kind of career, once you get it, you'd be crazy to leave early. This is something you're going to do until you retire. But increasingly, that has not been the case. As they've been cutting down staff to the bone, forcing more work out of each individual worker, more and more workers are retiring early and just not wanting to stay in this industry. So I think for a lot of workers, this is not just one more contract. This could be the contract to decide whether they stay in this industry or not.
Right. So let's jump now to the tentative agreement that was reached, because I think if anyone was following the rail negotiations last week, they probably saw a lot of headlines that said things like, a rail strike has been averted at the 11th hour, like Joe Biden, intercedes to prevent a rail strike. Now, as you point out in your piece, and as you alluded to here, the rail carriers and the unions really have only reached a tentative agreement. Now, that means that this still needs to be ratified by the union membership. What's in the agreement so far, and is a strike still likely?
Yeah, and I'll start with the point that you just said, that I think it's kind of irresponsible the way some of the media is reporting this. And it might just be because they don't understand how most unions work. But, to be clear, this is a tentative agreement. The workers still have to vote on it. So it's very possible that they will vote no. And it will go back to negotiations. We could possibly be at a strike threat again. And this process of voting, it looks like it's going to take at least 2 to 3 weeks before members can read the agreement, debate it, discuss it, and cast their vote. So the agreement, it's made some clear gains in some ways, and it's more ambiguous in others. So to start with the gains, on wages, this would represent the best wage increase for rail workers in over 40 years. So basically, this would be a 24% wage increase by 2024, including an immediate 14% raise. And remember, this contract was supposed to be ratified in 2020, so it only goes until 2024, and they'll have to negotiate again, which I'm sure will be very fun when that happens. Also, something that went underreported was the healthcare costs. So a big demand was no increase in copays and deductibles. It seems like this agreement caps the deductibles, so they will not have any increase in their healthcare costs. Another big important one was protection of two-person crews. It used to be that you would have about 4 or 5 rail workers manning these train cars. That's been cut down to 2. And, to think about how this is a safety issue, it's increasingly common now. You have trains that have 200 up to 200 cars attached that are about 2 or 3 miles long. So imagine one worker having to man that whole entire train car, often containing, dangerous materials and chemicals and things like that. So the carriers are trying to put it down to one worker. 2 people is not even enough, but right now it's 2. So this agreement for now protects two-person crews on these trains. But I think on the most important point, which again was the scheduling and attendance policies, it seems to be a little bit more ambiguous. So there is vague language, and there's still a lot not known about this agreement, which is also an issue. There's still some details that are not released that hopefully will be in the next few days. So there's a vague commitment to some more unpaid sick days without losing attendance points. And there's a commitment to one single paid sick day. So the original demand from workers was 15 paid sick days. So this is a far cry from that. Yeah. And this is where I want to talk, be very cautious in how I speak. I'm not a rail worker. I'm not in close touch with these workers. So I don't want to say for sure or not they're going to vote it down or not. We are seeing rumblings. Some groups like Railroad Workers United are kind of reporting out workers being very upset about this. And just thinking, if I was a railroad worker and the paid sick days was my number one issue, getting one would not necessarily be, for me, the biggest deal in the world. And especially because aside from that, this contract is very similar to the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations that a lot of the workers rejected. So it kind of remains to be seen. It seems like workers are still very upset. I don't have the biggest, broadest view of how that goes, but I would just say that we should definitely not assume as a given that these workers are going to vote for this contract. And Biden's been kind of doing this victory lap, and they're talking about it like it's a done deal. Maybe this is like psychological warfare. It's kind of like when Pete Buttigieg declared victory in Iowa. Before the results
or George Bush declaring victory in Iraq.
Yeah, right. And maybe this is part of just trying to pressure the workers into accepting this, but it's still very open what could happen. A lot of the key issues, it's not like it's very clear that there's been a big win. So it's a little bit ambiguous at this point.
Yeah. I guess that brings up a kind of broader question. And obviously this will vary from shop to shop, but how exactly do workers decide what a good contract is?
It's a good question. Now, part of this is the process that plays out in different unions. So some unions allow for more time for discussion and more avenues for discussion than others. It looks like they have a pretty robust process in these rail unions that are still going to vote on this, where members will get to see the agreement, be able to submit feedback and discussion and things like that. You're also probably going to see a lot of self-organization of workers, where there might be gaps in the process. Again, I think groups like Railroad Workers United are facilitating a lot of discussions of this agreement across unions, but there is going to be time built in to discuss this and vote on it. And there's a lot of factors that play into this. If a local union leadership is recommending workers vote for it, and they have credibility and things like that, that could sway some workers, or vice versa. But there has seemed to be throughout this process a little bit of a gap between what the rail union leaders have seen as a good deal and what the workers have, because back earlier in the summer, the leaders accepted an agreement that they put to membership for voting. And some of the unions, again, there are 12 different rail unions, which is
Hmm.
why this can be a little bit confusing. So there were many rail unions that have already accepted agreements, but there are currently two holdouts, which happen to be the unions with the most members
Right.
in the rail workforce.
Yeah.
But I think that they're going to get a chance to discuss this and cast their vote.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that all of this also brings up another kind of like big picture question, which is so obviously, at this point we kind of understand that if the rail workers, even just a small segment of them, went on strike, this would be like disastrous for the U.S. economy, right? And that brings up this question of I think the left often talks about so called strategic industries or strategic sectors, usually when we're talking about areas where we might want to organize or salt, right? And one question I have is I think that people often talk about so called strategic industries as though it's really obvious what that means. But I think it's actually not that obvious. So I want to ask you, Labor Paul, when people talk about strategic industries, aside from, obviously this consideration of it would be incredibly disruptive to the economy if these workers went on strike. Like, what else makes a sector strategic, or what should people mean when they talk about strategic industries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of look at three categories in talking about a sector being strategic. So one of them being, the more obvious one, the ability to shut down the economy and hurt profits. And I think logistics is kind of the most clear example of that. Even though we've had people covering this story for months, it was like
Mhm.
last week, all of a sudden, people were freaking out, just realizing the magnitude of, oh my God, if there's a rail strike, like we won't be able to get agricultural products where they need to be. Like it's going to affect everything. So
Right.
logistics, rail workers, UPS workers, Amazon workers, things like that is pretty obvious. I think another category we should think about is the inability to offshore or automate these jobs.
Hmm.
Obviously this has been a huge problem for the labor movement. That a key reason why union density has gotten lower is when companies are just shipping these jobs overseas or to a different area in the United States, and also automation, which is just continuing to accelerate. So if you can find a sector where capital can't do that as easily, that's going to give workers more leverage. It's going to give us the ability to organize in a more long-term way. And I think a third category to think about is a sector where workers have a deep connection to a broader social base, even if it is not necessarily a sector where they're going to hurt profits in an intense way. And bringing these categories together, people like Jane McAlevey and others, a lot of people in DSA have kind of come to agree with this idea. She has deemed three sectors to be particularly strategic: logistics, education, and healthcare. And I think for when we talk about inability to offshore and automate, they haven't figured out yet how to have like robotic nurses,
Right.
that are in hospitals. And obviously there are certain functions within a hospital that can be automated to a degree, but you just can't have yet this large scale automation. You also can't just ship a hospital overseas. That would, of course, defeat the whole point. There's also with healthcare, this connection to their patients. So many of we've covered this before in this show, many nurses strikes in recent years, I mean, really the last 10, 20 years, the defining issue has been safe staffing. And
Hmm.
part of that is improving the nurse's job, but it's also a way of saying we want to protect our patients, because when nurses are overwhelmed, that's unsafe for the patients. So they have this connection to the people that they are serving. And education fits that as well. I mean, we're seeing a rise in cyber charters and things like that. I think that stuff is going to accelerate, but
Hmm.
you still won't see in the near future this ability to just automate teaching. And as we're
Right.
seeing, we talked about on the last show, they're scrambling to get real live human teachers right now. And again, also you can't offshore, moving a public school to China is just not a thing. And then as we've seen in so many educator strikes, they've been able to link their demands and get the support of the broader community. And so even though, a teacher strike, it's not like you're hurting a company's profits per se, but you can cause a political crisis. If it's in a large public school district like Chicago or Los Angeles, if you're on strike for a week, that has disrupted everything, and it's kind of caused a political crisis.
Mhm.
So I think in that sense, these industries have this broader impact and are strategic for those reasons.
Yeah.
And now having said that, I don't think we should get too carried away and be like, okay, only those three sectors matter.
Right.
That's the only thing we focus on. Obviously, things like, construction, strategic. Everything matters, of course, but
Right.
I think
Right.
it's helpful to think about these key things. And I think this latest, crisis of the rail industry is just another wake up call. However much we want to talk about we're a service economy, we're post industrial. This is just a slap of reality in all of our faces. Like, oh yeah, shit. Everything depends on this industrial labor still. No matter, yes, a lot has changed, but everything depends on it. And just, there's 115,000 rail workers roughly, a relatively small amount of workers thinking about the whole economy. And even if just a fraction of those go on strike, you're talking about this massive crisis. So it's just another thing to remind us that we are not past industrial labor. It still matters. If anything, it might matter more than ever when we're talking about logistics and the way our supply chains have been organized.
Right. Right. So I guess maybe like let's wrap up on this. When we're talking about strategy, I kind of feel like anyone can come up with a theory of what the labor movement should do, right? But it seems to me that these strategy discussions really only become important or like at least become less abstract when organizing activity and union activity is ramping up, right? I guess the last question for you then is like, have we reached that point? Obviously, there's been a lot of excitement around, new organizing activity, and as you have pointed out, there are several big contracts, including the UPS contract that are expiring next year and could, maybe lead to a kind of burst of labor militancy. But have we reached the point where these strategy discussions are becoming important?
I think we're getting there where it's becoming more real. One example that sticks out is, various unions have talked about organizing Amazon forever.
Yeah.
Amazon Labor Union, the small independent union, for whatever reason, they're the ones to do it first,
Hmm.
despite not having the same resources that other unions do. But now I think it kind of served as like a shot in the arm to other unions. So like the Teamsters have established an Amazon organizing department and are looking at it more seriously. I think it's this moment where things are just happening already, and unions are looking at how to adapt to it. I also think there's a key window of opportunity here that I don't know how long will last. With this very friendly National Labor Relations Board that really has
Hmm.
made a difference. In getting Starbucks workers who are fired reinstated.
Hmm.
Same thing for Amazon workers. They're actually like holding these large companies accountable. Now, I hope this window survives,
Yeah.
past 2024, but we shouldn't assume that it will. And I think while there is that window of opportunity, we got to try to go as far as we can. But I think we're seeing this ferment happen both within unionized workers. So, remembering last year, John Deere workers,
Hmm.
Kellogg's workers voting down contracts and holding out for a better contract. IATSE workers almost going on strike. UPS may be happening in a year.
Hmm.
So both among unionized workers, which we need to happen, we need kind of this renewal and energy in the existing unions, and of course these new areas. So Amazon, Chipotle, Starbucks. So we're seeing both things happen at the same time, and it's raising interesting questions. I don't know how far this will go, and I think we should have a balanced view. On the one hand, it's very exciting, and we should be
Hmm.
excited about it. But I think sometimes people are getting carried away about declaring like this is the new upsurge in labor. I
Right.
think one thing to keep in mind, I saw someone put this on Twitter, when you think about it, you take all the Starbucks workers who have organized so far together and add them up. That's not as many workers that exist in just one Amazon plant.
Right.
So, thinking about Starbucks, we're talking still about a relatively small number of workers. But I think what it does serve, it has this symbolic power of this. It's spreading like wildfire. None of us predicted it.
Hmm.
It keeps spreading. It's something people can kind of engage with. There's been DSA chapters doing this thing where, you go in to Starbucks that's organizing, you order a coffee under the name Union Yes and stuff and
Right.
show support. So I feel like its power is more in almost the symbol of like going up against this big company and something spreading. But we shouldn't get so carried away when we think about the context of how many workers we're talking about,
Right.
what aspect of the economy. So I think there's a long way to go, but we're definitely seeing that this has staying power, which is also encouraging. We're seeing big strikes in healthcare. I mean, there was recently a very big strike in Minnesota with nurses unions and teachers. Now we see it spread to rail. So we're basically seeing every single sector is affected by this ferment in labor. And again, it's just reminding us that I think labor is going to remain a very big political question. Well, I think for socialists, it always was and always will be, but I think it's going to be on the agenda in these next few years. Again, where all this stuff goes, I don't know, but I think we're seeing some things starting to shift. And I think some of these strategic debates are becoming more real because of activity that's happening on the ground.
Strike while the NLRB iron is hot.
Yeah,
Pun
there you
obviously
go.
intended. All right. We will link Paul's article on the rail strike below. Paul, great to see you as always. Till next time.
Yeah, thank you.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.